Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to Drumversations. We are here every Friday just thinking, talking, sharing with each other music and ideas on how to heal, how to be, and how to be better after, during, and during the pandemic. So thank you for being here. As always, we want to take time to breathe and remember who we are. So breathe in and breathe out. Deep breath in and out. As we breathe in all the good the universe has for us, and out all the crazy anxiety and nuttiness that's going on in the world. In and out. And as you continue breathing, we know that that creates synchronicity even in the virtual space. Our breathing together connects us in a human and humane way. And as always, we want to remember our ancestors to help us remember ourselves. And this week, in the last week, we've lost a very important person in John Lewis, who's a revered ancestor now. So we want to remember him and put your family members' names or other honored ancestors in the chat. We'll call them out after we play the ancestral drum call. All right, we've got some folks. Norma Thomas, Ashe. David Lomax, Ashe. Philip Lomax, Ashe. Frank and Verna Mae Lomax, Ashe. Ashe-o. Before we get into today's topic of examining whiteness, I want to just make an announcement, a couple of announcements. We've got stuff for sale, as always, to help with the cause. We've got the 400-year suite and curriculum. You can get hard copies of the curriculum at mosaiceducationpress.com. You can get virtual copies and copies of the CD of our latest recording at marklomaxii.com. Also, finally, I guess, our oldest daughter is officially, we hope, we think, graduating next week on Friday, August 7th. So, yeah, so if, we could mask up Ohio, then we would have graduations. But anyway, we're hoping to have a graduation next week, which means we will not do Drumversations next week because we'll be celebrating Amira. But we'll be back the next week on the 14th. So today, I had this long title trying to think about or riff off of Du Bois's, W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of the double consciousness. And what he means by that term is how black people have to perform in public under the white gaze versus how they actually are in private or amongst family, friends, and their own community, right? So there's a veil and a mask that we have to put on to go out and perform respectability politics. If you want to keep your job, can't be too black. If you want to be successful, you can't be too black. If you want to be anything in a white world, you have to in some way be seen to ascribe to values of whiteness, right? But we've never really, people talk about these things, but we don't always deconstruct whiteness and what it is, how it developed, right? And there's a lot of research around this that a lot of folks just don't read or are not aware of. And I wanted to bring some of that to light. And in deconstructing whiteness, maybe we help change the situation in terms of perception of humanity, because that lens of whiteness is really a barrier, right? And it's a lens that white people have, obviously, but it's also a lens that has been forced upon non-white people. So my intention is to talk about the construct of whiteness. And if there's anyone who has some offense or takes offense to what I said, it's because you're white or you have ascribed and assimilated white values. And the issue here is not to offend, but to illuminate, to help people understand what that lens is and how we can use that understanding to overcome it. Because I think whiteness as a construct is psychological violence that has been perpetuated on European Americans. In particular, we're talking about the American context. but also on everybody else in America. And so the long title was Cognitive Dissonance and the Double Consciousness of Whiteness. You know, the short title, I think, is Examining Whiteness. So what made me think about this was just a question. You know, in my work as an artist, I'm always examining blackness and trying to figure out how, as a black man with a doctorate degree in classical composition who works in white spaces, I am representing my culture and my people and examining what blackness is in these white spaces and what blackness is in the context of my work as an artist, right? But I don't really come across white people examining whiteness. And for me, blackness is an identity issue, right? It's not just how I define myself culturally, but it's also, how I connect to the wider African diaspora. For me, blackness, or the term black, is a term that I accept and ascribe to myself to denote or connote the fact that I am of African descent, but have slavery in my lineage, which created a disruption in the evolution of culture that came down to me, right? So that means in an African context, my ancestors were African in all of that sensibility, whatever that means. God, culture, land, country, clan, ethnic group, all of that, right? But because of slavery, that got disrupted, and now I can't trace myself back lineage-wise to a particular geopolitical state, clan, ethnic group, what have you, God, country, all of that, unless I take a DNA test. And personally, I'm not taking DNA tests because I think they're using that. That's conspiracy stuff we can talk about another time, right? So slavery creates this disruption. And as Imam Amiri Baraka says, the blues people were created. And so I argue that blackness and black is an ethnic group that was created as a result of slavery, particularly in North America, right? I say North America specifically because in South America and the Caribbean, there was a different culture around slavery, where particularly in South America, there's more of a connection to roots. Of course, it was brutal and all of that stuff, but in terms of the wiping away or the whitewashing of culture, it was not as pervasive and total as it was in North America, right? You can tell from the drumming. If you listen to Afro-Cuban drumming, it sounds just like West African drumming. But if you listen to drumming in North America, we literally have a drum set, right? It's a derivation of Western European military march music, African drums, and Eastern cymbals or bell sounds, right? Whereas in, say, name a place in South America, Brazil, they use hand drums like we do in Africa, right? So there's more of a direct connection to that culture there than there is here. So the question that has been just rattling around in my head is, what does it mean to be white and human when whiteness has become responsible for gross imbalances of slavery, genocide, and global warming as examples, in the pursuit of material wealth as opposed to the spiritual and communal power that is central to our humanity, right? Whiteness as a psychology or as a construct has often moved in the toward material wealth and dominance as a form of power, as opposed to communal power. I am because we are. Ubuntu, African-centered consciousness. I think, therefore I am. Individual fragmentation from the group, Eurocentric consciousness, right? So whiteness has been used as a construct to justify slavery, right? If you weren't white, that means you weren't right. You weren't Christian, you weren't cultured, you had no history, you had no education. Therefore, slavery was a means of bringing you into culture, right? It was a means of bringing you to Jesus, as an example, right? We're enslaving people to introduce them to white Jesus, right? Whiteness as a construct, separating one group of people from the next and imposing one group of people's values on another group's without taking into account any of that other group's cultural values, history, and the like, right? Whiteness has become a pathology, right? A state of being that's out of balance because of the focus on material wealth, because of the focus on power as a form of domination, right? And even the notion of supremacy. I'm better than you just because I look a certain way. That means you cannot honor the human family because you see difference in everything that doesn't reflect you, right? That creates what we call cognitive dissonance. We'll talk about that later. And cognitive dissonance is a pathological state of mind. So when examining whiteness, I think the first question is, what is it and how do you become white, right? And then if whiteness is, as I've suggested, this pathological construct that has been detrimental to the world, right, because of evil practices like slavery, genocide, global warming, and all of the other things, right, then how do you heal from the disease of whiteness? How do we understand this construct, this pathology, and accept it for what it is, and then begin the work of healing? That's what we're going to talk about today after I play a piece I wrote back in 2013 on being. So, deconstructing and examining whiteness. So whenever I talk about this, somebody invariably says, well, black and white are opposites, right? So, you know, if you're talking about whiteness one way or blackness the other way, that means one of the others is right. So, like, if we're talking about whiteness is good, then black has to be bad. Or, conversely, if we're talking about blackness is good, then whiteness automatically has to be bad. And it's not an automatic because black, period, point blank, existed before white, right? Even the word Moor, which was used to describe the North Africans who invaded southern Europe in 711 Common Era, were described as black. That's the word Moor. That's what it means, right? And the way it was used. Kemet is another word for black. One of the original words for ancient Egypt, the word we used, ancient Kemet, land of the blacks, right? So we had an identity around kind of how we presented color-wise way before the construct of black was used in the way that we now understand it, right? And even Europe, before Europe, had color prejudice, right? The Greeks, you can read any of them, but particularly I think Socrates said, you know, he favors, you know, the complexion of his folks more than anyone, right? Plato was the same way, Aristotle, all of them had some kind of color consciousness, but that didn't mean white and black in terms of some kind of grouping ethnic-wise was used in the same way, right? If you were Greek, you were Greek. If you were Portuguese, you were Portuguese, right? And in the Germanic cultures, there were clans, right? So there was no Germany at a certain point. There was no France at a certain point, right? There was no England at a certain point. There were Anglos, there were Saxons. These are clans, family groups, ethnic groups, right? So it wasn't like white. Because if you're in a place where everybody is quote unquote white, then why would you describe yourself as white, right? The difference for us in Africa is because we understood that melanin and blackness, and we use that to identify with the cosmos. So we saw our skin tone as a manifestation of the cosmic all, which is why that was important to us, right? Whiteness also, because black came first, whiteness, if we're thinking about it in modern terms, was at the beginning a reflection of blackness, right? Here's the thing. Black as a color absorbs everything. White reflects everything, right? So if blackness absorbs everything and whiteness reflects, then the idea of whiteness was a reflection of blackness. How do we know this? Because all of those great Greek scholars and philosophers studied at the feet of ancient Kemites in what they called Egypt, right? Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, all of them studied in Africa, in Egypt. I say that because a lot of times you'll see people trying to disconnect Egypt from Africa. They were in Africa, in Egypt, studying at the feet of African scholars. So what started as whiteness started as a reflection of blackness. We still see it today. Anytime you dress formally, what color do you wear? You wear black, right? If you're a musician, you have your dress blacks. Why is black the color of formality, right? Why do magistrates and judges wear black when they have to make important decisions, right? Why in medieval Europe, before the expulsion of Africans in the late 15th century, why was the language of scholarship Arabic? That's not a European language, right? Why, it was the language of African people, the Moors, who practiced Islam, right? Why were all the sciences and concepts of deity that have been attributed to Rome and Greece really reflections of the ancient Kemetic pantheon of deity, right? Because whiteness as this cultural construct, before it came to be defined in the way that we understand it now, was a reflection of blackness, right? And I'm using white and black to kind of reinforce how we are using the language now, but understanding that that wasn't the case back then, right? Nobody in Greece or Rome said, hey, this is white culture. No, they didn't do that. It's Rome. It's Greece, right? Here's another example of the reflection. You know, Europe became a thing around the 9th century Common Era, right? And it was during the Renaissance period into the Enlightenment period that European scholars, and we're talking 16th, 17th, 18th century, they wanted to reconnect their intellectual heritage to Rome and Greece, right? But here's the thing. Just thinking about architecture, the first significant structure built in Greece was the Temple of Poseidon in 700 BCE. 700 BCE. By then, in Kemet, the step pyramids have been built. They were built in 2650 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built in 2560 BCE. The Sphinx was built in 2500 BCE, right? And then the Great Temple of Karnak was built in 204 BCE. So we were still building. We were building thousands of years before there was a Greece or Rome. These great structures that still exist today, right? So where were they getting their templates from? Where were they figuring out the math and the science that led to, you know, what we consider great revelations and discoveries of Europe, Copernicus and all this other kind of stuff? They were getting that from Africa, right? We established ideas of God. We created the sciences, math, art, everything. Culture came from Africa, right? And not even Kemet. It started in the interior and then moved up the Nile, you know, through Nubia and the Sudan to what now is called Egypt, right? And then it got to Greece and Europe. So this notion of whiteness has always existed as a mirror of blackness up until 1492, right? So that period of what they call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, which is about 500 to 1500 or so, roughly, you know, was a period of upheaval, great unrest, right? The 15th and 16th centuries were the Renaissance, you know, but up until then, what was becoming Europe through war, right? Which consolidated power and created these geopolitical states. There was great famine because feudalism was such that it didn't really deal with the people, it dealt with those in power. Sound familiar? The feudal idea meant that if I owned the land, I owned everything on the land, including the people, and I extracted resources from those people to their detriment. And I would be cool, and I would be healthy, and those people would be poor, paupers, right? Peasants. That's where that comes from, right? Now, the interesting thing is, just like today with Corona, when famine struck, your wealth didn't protect you, right? Just like it won't protect the wealthy folks now. But that doesn't prevent them from extracting as much as possible from, quote unquote, the common folks. So these ideals that we see bearing out in modern capitalism come from this old notion of feudalism and the way Europe developed its ideas and notions of power. A few weeks ago, we talked about that as a deficit mentality. And so you try to hoard resources to make sure that you and those you care about are cool at the expense of everyone around you, right? So that's what was going on. And then the Moors were expelled from Spain in 1492. Interestingly enough, that's when other things started happening, right? Christopher Columbus and all of these happenings in the late 15th century that started to generate wealth for European kings and queens at the expense of Africa and other folks around the world, right? And then you have the Renaissance really taking flower in the 15th century. But Renaissance is French for rebirth. And if historically whiteness as an idea before it became a construct was a reflection of blackness that was going on in Africa, what was being reborn? Why would they call whatever was happening at that time in the 1500s a rebirth? I would call it a rebranding, right? because what had happened up until that point was, the stronghold of the church, Roman Catholicism and Anglican churches came to power. All of these different religious ideas were dominating and continue to, but there was a flowering of science, right? The theft of African ideas that were then rebranded as European ideas and through the Enlightenment traced back to Greece and Rome. That's thievery, right? And this is where you start seeing the separation from acknowledging, if reluctantly, the intellectual heritage that was coming from and out of Africa to now a specifically European origin in Greece, right? In Rome. So I would consider rebirth a rebranding. And it was this period during this rebirth, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that whiteness came to be identified as opposite of blackness, right? So you have folks like Ben Franklin writing in 1751 during the Enlightenment that he was partial to the complexion of his country, right? So he's preferring whiteness, and he confers upon whiteness all things good. And that means blackness now represents all things bad, right? And Ibrham Kendi says in Stamped from the Beginning that Enlightenment ideas gave legitimacy to this long-held racist partiality, the connection between lightness and whiteness and reason on one hand, and then darkness and blackness and ignorance on the other, right? So that's a relatively new idea that starts to reinforce constructs of whiteness and blackness to generally, very broadly describe people based on their superficial presentation, right? I'm going to play something, and then we're going to talk about how that leads to cognitive dissonance, and then how we can heal from it. The whole time I'm like, how do you play cognitive dissonance on the drums? It's not just chaos, it's disjointed, it's disoriented. So you have to think, when you start to tell yourself a story that's not real, and you begin to pass that lie down through generation after generation, and that lie creates differentiation that then systems of power are built around, everybody starts to believe fake news. When you tell yourself a lie and you begin to pass that lie down from generation to generation, and you begin to then build structures of power that reinforce that lie, everybody begins to believe fake news, right? That is the very core of cognitive dissonance that comes at the expense, or not at the expense, that comes as a result of this lie, this myth of white supremacy, right? And as we have described and detailed, and I'm gonna give you some books that kind of go through all this at the end, but that myth of white supremacy really starts to happen during the Renaissance and is then even more reinforced in the Enlightenment, and with each successive generation and century up until today, it becomes more and more ingrained in global culture. That's why I have always said that whiteness as a construct is a virus, and it's a mental health issue. It's a pathology, right? Now, here's why. Cognitive dissonance is what made chattel slavery, the genocide of First Nation folks, and even the way in America white women and poor white folks are and have been treated normal. Cognitive dissonance is, in and of itself, an issue where you don't see normal things normally, right? You believe things that aren't real as though they are, right? Africans were reduced to blacks, and according to Kendi and Stamp from the beginning, there had always been color privileges, as we discussed, but racial constructs are new and started to create these fractures in the psyche of white and black folks, right? The term black was first used by Gomez Ins de Zurara. I just butchered this name, but essentially the Portuguese Prince Henry passed away, and his nephew, King Alfonso V, commissioned this dude Gomez to write a biography of Prince Henry. And this is where we start seeing the word black used to describe people from Africa, regardless of their ethnic identifications, as a single group. And this is also where we find first the racist idea that someone like Prince Henry would go and save these people on some kind of missionary trip, right? Because these are heathens, they're barbarians, and even the word beast is used, right? And this happened in 1421. 1421, right? Now think about this. The Moors were expelled from Spain in 1492. So Portugal begins this rebranding, right? This use of black to address everything that they thought was wrong with people who didn't look like them in 1452. And by 1492, these ideas had caught on to such an extent that they marshaled resources in Southern Europe to fight the African presence and drive it out of their lands. That's the power of branding, right? This reduction justified enslavement on religious grounds. It established a set of racist ideas and ideals that would be built upon for centuries and laid the groundwork for why today it is so difficult for white America to see the humanity of anyone else, right? That fracture begins in the mid-15th century, right? So what are the cultural values of whiteness that make it what it is? Well, in Dr. Linda James Meyer's book, Optimal Psychology, An Introduction to an African Worldview, she says the ontological nature or nature of reality for whiteness, and that's my word, she doesn't use that word, is material with possible spiritual aspect, but it is separate and secondary. Whereas the African idea of being and reality is spirit first. The concept of whiteness, the Eurocentric value, is material first, right? That's why material wealth, power as domination or control over, became a cultural value, right? That's another fragmentation, right? Everything is outside of you. Anything internal is just what you need to deal with to get the external things, the material values, right? You have competition, individualism. Your sense of well-being is in constant flux and struggle. Think about how in America, in a capitalist society, if you don't have X amount of money in the bank, you don't always feel secure, safe and secure. If you can't pay your bills, you don't feel secure. If you can't eat, you don't feel secure. This is why, quote unquote, the white working class are refusing to wear masks and demanding that the economy open up because they don't feel safe and secure, right? It's not just race. They're responding to the way whiteness is impacting their psychology right now, right? Because they have been given the white hand of fellowship and not the benefits of whiteness, right? Continual confrontation, love orientation is conditional, whereas the African concept is unconditional, and one's group orientation is unity through common goals or a specific aim. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as opposed to unity through ideology. I am because we are, and because we are, I am. All right? So whiteness is a combination of these values, these ideals that separate you from everything else and everyone else, unless you can control it, right? So to be white means to be in control of something. To be white is to be valued over something, right? White is not humane, because if you acted humane, you could not be in control of people in the way that whiteness has controlled people. If you were humane and acting in an Afrocentric worldview where you're a part of everything, then you could not own land at the expense of the land itself. Does that make sense? Right? You could not own land because oil was there and you extract those resources and really destroy the land, but you earn material wealth because you've created these systems of power and exchange around this construct of whiteness. So to be white is to extract resources, is to destroy, is to dominate, right? That is the core value of what we have seen whiteness become since the mid to late 15th century. Right, so the question becomes now, how do we heal from that pathology, from that sense of separation, right? Well, first we have to understand that it is an identity that was created, right? And if it's an identity that was created and that identity then caused cognitive dissonance, or the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitudes of change, right? Christian slave owners, that's an oxymoron. How can you espouse Christian values and then own people and treat them the way slave owners treated people, right? That's cognitive dissonance. Killer cops, that's cognitive dissonance. That's how whiteness performs itself in public with respect to non-white bodies, right? Serve and protect, except for, right? The KKK, it's a Christian org. Gotta love white Jesus, right? It doesn't make sense if you understand what is supposed to be Christian values and then what the KKK stands for and has done historically and continues to do. That is what cognitive dissonance is, and that is the nature of whiteness, right? It's in constant flux. Racism has changed over the years to meet the needs of today, right? It's not something that if you understood 30 years ago, you still understand today. You have to always be trying to catch up with it because it's always shifting because of the sickness that's pervasive in the pathology of whiteness and, by extension, those who assimilate those ideas and values, right? So it's something that can be taught. It has been taught, right? It's a set of learned behaviors and performative postures like social cues that are adopted through psychological trauma and passed down from generation to generation. As an example, in the book Learning to Be White, Thandeka takes us through a construction of white identity, right? And she uses examples from her white friends where, you know, they were driving through a black neighborhood or a white neighborhood and the doors were unlocked and the windows were down. When they get to a black neighborhood, someone from the front, a parent, mother or father, they lock the doors. They say, lock your doors and roll up your windows. Now, they're not explicitly saying we're going into a black neighborhood and therefore it's dangerous, but those are cues, social cues, that infect the subconscious at a deep level and creates this sense of difference. It fragments, right? Now, as a child, you might be of European descent and you might have a best friend in preschool who's of African descent. As a child, you've not yet learned these values, but we see them as early as 3 because these are learned behaviors. You observe your parents behave in a certain way and you model that behavior. They model that behavior and you reflect that behavior, right? Another thing, like you might have grown up in rural America and your parents never told you anything about black people. They never said anything about anybody. And you go to college and you meet a person of color and you fall in love with that person, you bring them home. And all of a sudden your dad's not having it, right? In that moment, you have to choose the safety and what you've known with respect to family and the support you get from family, or what you feel to be true in being there's nothing wrong with this person. Why are you behaving like that, right? That creates another fragmentation of the psyche, right? And all of those things are making people of European descent conform to these values to belong, right? Everybody wants black culture, but nobody wants to be black, because to be black means to not belong to mainstream culture because of these fragmented experiences that create difference. And that means that you start to see people differently and less than, because that's how you've been socialized, right? So if racism and whiteness are learned behavior, then they can be unlearned, right? This is the healing part. It's not easy, right? Most psychologists say that if you've experienced a trauma for X amount of time, it takes about that much time to heal from it. So if you're a 50-year-old white person who is just now waking up and becoming quote unquote woke, that doesn't mean that your work is done because you're starting to see things or you're aware of things. It means your work has just begun. And it will take you probably another 50 years, if you live that long, to completely overcome the level of trauma that has been inflicted upon you. Right? Whiteness as a construct is psychological violence that is perpetuated against white people by white people. Your mother, your father, your grandparents, people you love, and people who love you are teaching you every day how to be white, even in the best of circumstances, right? We have to understand the problem is that these are subconscious cues. In many cases, in a lot of cases, yes, they are overt cues. But in many cases, particularly when it comes to the white liberal, these are subconscious cues. So you have to then do some work. And I've outlined a few steps, right? I borrowed some of this language from human-centered design frameworks. 1, embrace fear and discomfort, right? As soon as you start to realize these things and you become woke, right, to the world around you, it's going to scare you because then you start to realize how you've been complicit. And it makes you uncomfortable. And that's why a lot of white people don't want to talk about these things. I don't have the language, or I don't know, you know, that's fine. That's good. You're new, right? Welcome to the fight for liberation and humanity. You got to do some work, right? And it's psychological work, like really unpacking what has been done to you and why you believe what you believe. But it's also spiritual work. Right, at the core of who we are as human beings is spiritual connection. And so you have to get to the point where you are connecting with yourself and others in spirit and in truth, as some folks say. And that's what we call forever work. So you have to prepare for sustained engagement, right? Healing is just the first step in optimizing your humanity. And that's really what this comes to, right? Optimizing your own humanity so you can be connected to the rest of humanity. The second step is learning how to live into the new reality that comes as a result of acknowledging the psychological trauma and violence that was forced upon you by people you love and people who love you, right? You can't just feel that and feel that pain and stop because it's too painful. You have to really get through all of that to get to the next step. You have to also be transparent with yourself and others about where you are and where you want to be, right? Honesty and authenticity are the best ways to really get to the healing. And here are some questions that you can start with as you begin this line of inquiry, right? Why do I think this way about that particular issue? Why do I believe what I believe about an issue? Why do I feel the way I feel about those people, that group of folks, or those issues when it pertains to those people, right? Reparations is a great example, right? America has paid reparations to people in the past. America has practiced socialist values with people in the past, particularly white folk. Think about the GI Bill, where less than 2% of eligible black GIs actually got to use the benefits of the GI Bill, right? Think about housing assistance. Think about suburbs that were built for white people. Think about redlining. Think about all of the policies and procedures, banking, everything has been built for you, white folk, not for us. So when it comes to reparations, you have a lot of white people who are quote unquote well-meaning say, well, I don't believe in handouts, I believe in hands up, but you have benefited from handouts. So why do you think about those issues the way you do, right? That deep line of questioning and inquiry hopefully will expose some things if you're honest and transparent with yourself and others that help you along this path. Lastly, you have to be open to seeing the ways in which Eurocentric notions of power, wealth, military, police, access to resources, etc., are used to perpetuate the oppression of marginalized groups, from black people to people who, identify as gender nonconforming, right? It is everywhere in the culture, right? Because I'm black, I focus on issues of blackness, right? But whiteness impacts and affects every function of human beingness. And in order to change that, we have to rethink, reimagine every aspect of human beingness, right? These are just a few suggestions to help you get started. The books I promised I would tell you about are Learning to be White by Thandeka, Invention of the White Race by Theodore Allen, Iceman Inheritance by Michael Bradley, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroy, and Racecraft by Dr. Karen Fields and Dr. Barbara Fields. It's a lot of content. We only really have an hour. I'm supposed to be done. We're a minute over. But I wanted to help folks who are white, and even people who aren't, understand what the construct is. Because whiteness is the problem. The pathology of whiteness is the problem. And if we really want to have a just and equitable society, we have to focus on the real problem, right? It is not black people, the criminalization of blackness. It's not all of that. Those are all symptoms of what whiteness has become. So we change the world when we help folks heal from the pathology of whiteness, right? Remember, we're not here next week because we're celebrating Amira and her graduation. Please check out our Drumversations podcast on Spotify, iTunes, and SoundCloud. Check out the website. We've got a new record coming out next month. You can pre-order that. And please, 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 check out the resources I mentioned. Do your work. Black people, do your work. White people, do your work. Brown people, do your work. Everybody, do your work, because it's in doing our work individually that we connect together on a human level and we change this world. Ashe, take it easy.